So, we'll be talking about both Blade Runner films today, both the 1982 original by Ridley Scott and the 2017 sequel entitled Blade Runner 2049, directed by Denis Villeneuve, who directed also Arrival, to which Rowling made a reference earlier. And we will start our brief exploration by revisiting the endings of both films. This, of course, means that there will be major spoilers for those who haven't seen either or one of those of the two films, but you haven't seen the films. Perhaps these fragments will inspire you to watch them. Although, if you have not seen the films and are planning to watch them, please be warned that these are rather brutal and dark movies with lots of graphic violence and somewhat gloomy atmosphere. Not so much the clips we will be showing now, but the brutality in the films, I think, serves their narrative and subject matter, and it is not gratuitous. So the first clip, at the end of Blade Runner 1982, that's the year it came out, the replicant Roy Batty is mad with anguish as the Blade Runner Deckard, and these Blade Runners, as you know, were the special police units tasked with killing replicants. So Deckard had just killed the last replicant of their group, Pris, who happened to be at the same time Roy's love interest. Roy reacts furiously and erratically, and their encounter quickly turns into a sinister and brutal cat and mouse pursuit, where Deckard is massively outmatched by the replicant, who is himself racing against the clock as he starts feeling his short life quickly approaching its end. So in our first clip, after having led Deckard to his impending death, as the Blade Runner dangles hopelessly from the roof of a tall building, Roy unexpectedly saves Deckard's life. This counterintuitive moment is followed by what seems to be an existential about-face as Roy sits down before a terrified Deckard, and his demeanor now suddenly gentle and friendly, he voices in a few poetic words his regret of losing a life he had just begun to cherish. In what we've just seen, Kay, another Blade Runner, who happens this time to be himself an obedient replicant, saves Deckard's life from the hands of Wallace's guards, the industrialist who had taken over the manufacturing of replicants from the defunct Tyrell Corporation, and who, even more so than his predecessor, seems obsessed with creating more human than human replicants. That was the motto of the Tyrell Corporation. In saving Deckard's life, Kay is mortally wounded, as we could see, but he pushes himself before dying to take Deckard to meet his daughter. Following this last effort, Kay lies down and dies peacefully under the falling snow. And this moment is made to mirror the ending of the first film, where Roy had died after having similarly performed a selfless act. So what I will focus on, starting from these two culminating scenes, is the idea that these films present the becoming of their non-human protagonists. Replicants were conceived and perceived initially as mere biological machines, as soulless human replicas, but they aspire to become true beings. Yet they seem to aspire to attain a different humanity from that displayed by the humans in this dystopian universe. In a sense, they seem determined to acquire a higher humanity, if we can say that, which makes the parable even more potent, as those not called to be human, in effect forbidden to become human, are the ones who seek the ideal of the perfect human being. while humans who are born with a soul, it is assumed, are resigned to a subhuman existence. The replicant's progress is essentially the journey of metanoia, wherein they discover, through suffering, a selfless, self-sacrificial and compassionate life. The fact that this metanoia is presented as that process which ultimately defines the fullness of humanity connects us already with important themes in Orthodox theology. And I have a PowerPoint which I will try to activate now. The Blade Runner films address fundamental philosophical or metaphysical questions. Fundamental questions like creator versus creation, the nature of reality, the meaning of life, what makes us human, and so on. In a sense, it is not then surprising that both films also present numerous religious references or intimations, some intentional, some perhaps unintended, or springing from the scriptwriter's subconscious. Indeed, there is a multitude of theological or biblical references. In the first film, for instance, the replicant Roy Batty, whom we've just seen saving Deckard, mysteriously quotes William Blake's line about angels from Blake's poem, America, a Prophecy. Fiery the angels fell, deep thunder rolled around their shores, burning with the fires of oak. This is a misquote, actually, where Roy deliberately replaces the angels rose with the angels fell. This presumably hints to his perception of himself and his fellow replicants as fallen angels who have fallen from grace and are rebelling against their maker. At the end of the film, when Roy feels paralysis taking hold of his right arm, a sign of his impending demise, he drives a big nail through his hand in order to postpone his dying. It is with this nail-pierced hand that he saves Deckard's life, as we could see, thus in a way acquiring some sort of Christ-like character. Also, in his last moments, Roy holds a dove which flies up to the sky at the moment of his death, possibly symbolizing Roy's soul rising to heaven. Very interestingly, in Blade Runner 2049, the only detail surviving about the missing child born from a replicant is that he or she suffered from Galatians syndrome. Why a reference to Galatians? Could it hint to the dispute addressed in St. Paul's epistle with regard to the Gentiles of Galatia accepting Jesus as the Son of God without being the chosen people? Paul's insistence that Galatians could certainly follow Christ could perhaps suggest that replicants as outsiders and not originally part of the chosen community could now be counted together with humans as part of the same race. The child bearing this Galatian syndrome could perhaps represent this very union between outsiders and the chosen people. Who knows? Indeed, at one point, the leader of one revolutionary replicant says that baby meant we were more than creations. We were creation. Replicants seem to see themselves as part of creation alongside humans. And it is intriguing that she did not say, we are also creators. Could it be that the replicants see themselves as part of God's creation? I must mention that, simplistic though it may sound, as an Orthodox, I was struck by the frequency of the recurring key phrase, born, not made, throughout Blade Runner 2049, which made me think every time of the Niceno-Constantinopolitan Creed, which is intoned at every Orthodox liturgy. However, I sincerely doubt that we can talk in any of the Blade Runner films of any coherent Christian theological vision, nor should we assume that the religious elements were introduced meaningfully as part of a greater overall message, or at least one which is directly relevant for Orthodox theology. The religious philosophical syncretism presented in both films is derived almost certainly from the author on whose work the first film, and arguably the second as well by association, was based, Philip K. Dick. Dick is nowadays celebrated as one of the world's greatest writers of science fiction, a visionary who half a century ago raised questions which appear to have become increasingly relevant today. False realities, human versus machine, social control. Dick was extremely interested at the same time in theology, and a great body of his posthumous writings can be said to fall into the category of theological philosophy, albeit possessed of a very eccentric Dickian flavor. With regard to his constant questioning of the nature of reality, Dick underlined its importance, saying, "Today we live in a society in which spurious realities are manufactured by the media, by governments, by big corporations, by religious groups, political groups, and the electronic hardware exists by which to deliver these pseudo-worlds right into the heads of the reader, the viewer, the listener." Now we can clearly see how his words apply much better to our world today than they did 40 years ago when Dick wrote them. Many of Philip K. Dick's books have been turned into films, bringing his themes into the consciousness of our age. Besides Blade Runner, there were Minority Report, Total Recall, Paycheck, Imposter, Adjustment Bureau, A Scanner Darkly, and many others. Two topics fascinated Dick above everything else, appearing in almost all of his writings. And these were, what is reality? The first. And the second, what constitutes the authentic human being? The latter topic, I think, is relevant to us when exploring parallels between the Blade Runner films and theology. And Dick has an answer to this fundamental question: what constitutes the authentic human being? That is what he says. The authentic human being is one of us who instinctively knows what he should not do, and in addition, he will balk at doing it. He will refuse to do it, even if it brings down dread consequences to him and to those whom he loves. This, to me, is the ultimately heroic trait of ordinary people. They say no to the tyrant, and they calmly take the consequences of this resistance. Their deeds may be small and almost always unnoticed, unmarked by history. Their names are not remembered, nor do these authentic humans expect their names to be remembered. I see their authenticity in an odd way, not in their willingness to perform great heroic deeds, but in their quiet refusals. In essence, they cannot be compelled to be what they are not. Now, Dick's preoccupation with what makes an authentic human being and the Blade Runner movies as vehicles for exploring this fascination of his resonate with what appears to be the topical theme in Orthodox theology today. For instance, for Orthodox theologian Immanuel Klapsis, living in a modern pluralistic society invites the Orthodox to rethink what it means to be a human person. We are in a stage, Klapsis writes, of searching for a new anthropology that emphasizes the interdependence of humans with nature, provides a greater space for tolerance of different ways of being a human being, and binds irreducibly different people into living communities of peace, justice, and love. Now, Metropolitan Kallistos Ware, in his brief but extremely significant book, Orthodox Theology in the 21st Century, maintains that recent Orthodox preoccupation with the Church will soon give way to theological engagement with what it means to be human. The key question this century will be, according to him, not only what is the Church, but also and more fundamentally, what is the human person? What does it mean, more specifically, to be a person in relation according to the image of God, the Holy Trinity? Metropolitan Callistos actually singled out the 4 reasons which make a discussion on personhood essential to our times. Now, the first reason is urbanization and globalization, which can lead to the kind of collectivism in which personal diversity is obliterated. The second reason is that our age is increasingly dominated by machines, an aspect which further emphasizes the importance of interpersonal communion of love. You may love your computer, says the good bishop, but your computer does not love you back. The third reason why a discussion on personhood is essential is the ethical implications of genetic engineering, which can bring to a breakdown of the institution of marriage and the way we view gender and sexual morality. And his fourth reason is the disastrous ecological tragedy, which is due not primarily to a crisis in the physical environment as such, but to a crisis in the human heart, an anthropological crisis. This because we have forgotten our authentic human identity, our true relation as human beings to the material world, and our supreme human vocation as priests of God's creation. So we have rampant urbanization, machine domination, the ethics of genetic engineering, and the ecological disaster, all themes which are also central in the Blade Runner films. And we have therefore enough ground, so to say, to base a parallel discussion between the themes of the Blade Runner universe and certain fundamental themes of Orthodox, or perhaps more widely Christian theology. I propose that the discussion on the essential themes in Orthodox anthropology would follow 2 pathways. First, freedom versus death, and secondly, and more importantly, being human as a process of becoming. Let's talk first a little about death and its tyranny as depicted in the 2 films. In the first Blade Runner, death certainly appears as a central theme. Here, fear of death is what relentlessly drives the replicants in their pursuit, as they become painfully aware that they cannot enjoy their newly discovered lives to the same extent that their human makers can. They were given the punishment of early death precisely not to allow them to develop as humans, to experience fear, anger, envy, but also awe, compassion, love. They seem to be banned from developing a consciousness. In their undeveloped state, replicants are thought to be incapable of empathy, and it is only by measuring this deficiency that Blade Runners are expected to detect them. However, replicants consistently seem to go against such expectations, despite their heart rates and eye movements still giving them away, albeit with lesser and lesser efficiency, when Blade Runners administer their Voigt-Kampff empathy test. Replicants certainly seem to appreciate the gift of life more than their human counterparts. The only relationships we see in the film are almost always between replicants, and often loving relationships. Humans, at least the ones depicted in the film, seem to grimly go through the motions, living lives in solitude, despondency, and resignation. Replicants live passionately and intensely, their lives guided by inquisitiveness. How else would Roy be able to have already read Blake's poetry, which he quotes, or Pris to have heard about Descartes, as she quotes his adage, "I think, therefore I am." Replicants are eager to collect photos of their lives and of their loved ones in an attempt to quickly create memories for the lives that they cherish. While they are cruel and unforgiving to their human oppressors, replicants deeply care for one another. Leon, one of the replicants, is devastated when witnessing Zora's death at the hands of Deckard. When having to convey the news of one of the replicants' friends' death, Roy breaks into tears in front of Pris, the replicant he loved. In fact, while it was the fear of imminent death that drove them, replicants don't always care only about their own life. When explaining the urgent need to meet Tyrell and have their life extended, Roy seems more pained and concerned about the life of the woman replicant he loved. He tells Sebastian, the genetic designer working for Tyrell, if we don't find help soon, Pris hasn't got long to live. We can't allow that. He is more concerned about her dying, although his death too is imminent. It is certainly ironic that humans see a lack of empathy to be the defining deficiency of the replicants, when in fact replicants prove to possess a much greater degree of compassion than any of the humans depicted. Now, at the end of the film, as Roy watches Deckard about to die, as the latter's grip on the building roof is weakening, Roy tells him emphatically, quite an experience to live in fear, isn't it? That's what it is to be a slave. Similar words, painful to live in fear, isn't it, are said to Deckard by another replicant, Leon, who is also about to kill him earlier in the film before Deckard's life is saved at the last moment. The replicants seem to want to make Deckard understand right before he dies that it is that fear which he feels as his life is slipping away that they have experienced their whole life, the constant anguish of being enslaved by death. In Orthodox theology, this life and death, as put by Gregory of Nyssa, is primarily what humans have acquired after the fall, but it is something we are expected to transition from, a transitory state we are called to transcend. In the words of Greek theologian Panayotis Nellas, man no longer has life in the way that he did previously, as a characteristic proper to his being. Life continues only so long as death is postponed. That which exists now, after the fall, in the proper sense, is death. Life has been transmuted into survival. But in Christian theology, by rising again, Christ has fully eradicated the tyranny of death in human nature, as expressed by Saint Nicholas Capasilas. And to quote Nellas again, through the resurrection of the blessed flesh of the Lord, human nature was freed from slavery to corruption and death. It is particularly revealing in our exploration today how theology associates slavery with death and freedom to the life in Christ to which we are called. In Blade Runner 2049, replicants, but also humans, also seem to be subjected to the slavery of death, but in a different way. Replicants now face death whenever they are monitored through the so-called baseline test, a regular complex process administered by an impersonal machine which gauges the replicant's emotional response in an attempt to detect the slightest sign of nonconformity or revolt. Death is imbued in the very oppressive system itself, which controls every single move of all replicants, but presumably of all humans as well. The fact that the world of 2049 seems to follow a more sparse and austere aesthetic of Stalinist inspiration, often conjuring up flickers of Orwell, is perhaps not accidental. It is the ability to give birth that appears as an antidote to death, both for Wallace and for the replicant rebels in the second film. However, the two replicants' transformation before death points to an inner transformation, to a metanoia, which does not only make them human, but even more human than human. in Orthodox anthropology, to be human is something humans are called to discover. Father John Bear, a famous British Orthodox theologian, has written a wonderfully poetic little book entitled Becoming Human. And he very clearly delineates the foundation of Orthodox anthropology. To be human is to become human, not something given or inherited. It is a goal, something we constantly aspire towards. And the fullness of humanity we are called to acquire is shaped by relationships with our family, with our friends, with all those around us. As put by Emmanuel Klapsis, in Orthodox theology, human beings cannot be fully understood by simply observing how they are or act as entities in themselves within the created world. God's relationship with the world and the role that human beings play in that relationship are defining elements of being human. But towards what goal do we aspire? It is the fulfillment of our image likeness to God. It is the gradual acquiring of the life in Christ. This is where the journey towards being human overlaps with deification, in a sense. By living this life in Christ and being reformed in his image, humanity is called to human plenitude in the image of the archetype, the firstborn of all creation. Through our participation in the sacramental life of the Church, in the Eucharist and the Holy Mysteries, and through our life in prayer and love in communion with Christ and with one another, we are incorporated into Christ. We acquire a Christocentric being and a way of life corresponding to it, wherein death has lost its dominion. In Christianity, humanity is called to transition from one paradigm of existence to another, from the life started with a physical birth, which gives us an organism capable of living this mortal life, to another life started by a spiritual birth, wherein Christ creates in humans a new spiritual organism. It is this transition which makes our life in union with Christ possible and renders death irrelevant. So, is any of these themes central to an Orthodox Christian anthropology present in any of the Blade Runner films? The simple answer, I think, is no. Then you may ask, where is the connection between Blade Runner and theological anthropology? And what I propose as a potential theological reading of the two films is grounded, first of all, in the replicants' quest to become human. Yes, they have been given a human form, in fact copying human anatomy in its smallest details, but they are not expected to act human. They are perceived as instruments or machines who can exploit it at will, who can be retired, not killed, at the first sign of nonconformity. They are certainly not perceived as possessing a soul. When the replicant Blade Runner K is tasked with retiring the replicant's born child, he is reluctant. To be born is to have a soul, he ponders. However, he too aspires to become human, and his last sacrificial act is meant to achieve precisely that. He gives his life for Deckard, while remembering Freya's words, and Freya being the leader of the replicant rebels, who said, "Done right, dying is the most human thing we do." In dying, he becomes truly human. More importantly, perhaps, there is an indication that replicants no longer see themselves as made in the image of the human archetype, but in the image of the child that was born from their kind. When realizing that Kay had wrongly believed that he was the child, Freya comforts him. "You imagine it was you. We all wish it was us. That's why we believe." The birth of a replicant child had shifted the paradigm from death and despair to life and hope. Replicants no longer need humans as models for their accomplishment. They can become more human than human on their own, breaking away from their dependency and subservience to the human race. In the first Blade Runner, we see Roy yearning to be more human than human. We're not machines, he exclaims at one point in the film. We're physical. When encountering his human maker, besides his enormous rage in the face of his, and most importantly, his lover's impending death, he also appears tearful and remorseful. In a moment resembling a confession, he tells Tyrell, whom he calls father, "I've done questionable things." His superior intellect and learnedness come through invariably in all his interactions with humans, whom he seems to regard with a mixture of curiosity and amused condescension. In the face of death, both Roy and Kay transcend their circumstances and their condition precisely because they seek to transcend the fallen condition of the humans who populate their world. They seek to become authentically human. They engage in selfless acts of kindness, in the case of Kay, even risking his own life to save the life of others, to engage in a just cause. Having accepted death, they choose a different path of selflessness and freedom and become truly human. But replicants are striving constantly not only to become human, but to become better. They're trying to transcend not only their replicant condition, but also the very human condition they are called to replicate. Replicants are engaged in a process of becoming, whereas humans are stagnant in their tired ways. It is precisely this movement of metanoia which makes us ask the question in the end, who are the real humans? And it is this becoming, this transformation that brings to mind, in my view, a Christian theological perspective. After performing his selfless act, Roy undergoes a radical change, preparing peacefully for his death, free from fear. While he feels deep sorrow for the life he is about to lose, he voices this in poetic words that reveal perhaps a deeper understanding of life, a way to see his life from the perspective of eternity. All these moments, he says, will be lost in time like tears in rain. Moreover, he wishes to impart this inner peace, this freedom, this newfound kindness to Deckard as he is about to die. And in Blade Runner 2049, Kay does not expect gratitude for saving Deckard's life and for uniting him with his daughter. He conceals his enormous pain and indeed the fact that he was dying. And this is an intimate, internal decision he has taken for himself. While he is dying the death that he has chosen, he seems at peace while cherishing the falling snowflakes for the last time. There is in these moments almost a pastoral component and a pedagogical one as well. Through their desperate quest for true humanity, the replicants teach humans how to aspire towards their own human plenitude. They teach humans that any presumptions about an inherited humanity are less important than the process, that becoming is living, and it should replace being, which often comes to signify a different sort of death. If this is one of the central messages of the Blade Runner films, then this is the place where a Christian theological reflection can take over and start a meaningful discourse on what becoming human means. Thank you very much. I'll stop the share.
Thank you very much, Razvan, and congratulations on showing 2 film clips without a disaster.
Yes, I was a bit scared.
Yeah, as you know, I abandoned my attempt to show a film clip, fearing that it wouldn't work. Yes, I mean, you've given me a lot to respond to, and you kindly sent me a draft of your talk earlier, which enabled me to prepare a slightly more formal response rather than just scrabbling for things off the top of my head. And again, this theological aspect comes, to some extent from the Philip K. Dick novel, which was the source of the first film, and which is in fact saturated with theological ideas and theological images. And I actually had a big problem when I first saw Blade Runner in the 1980s, when it first came out, because I thought it had stripped out much of the most interesting moral and theological aspects of the book, like, for instance, the use of an empathy box by human beings to fuse with the sufferings of a Christ-like figure called Mercer, who's sort of struggling up a hill with rocks being thrown at him, and if you can empathize with his suffering, that shows you're fully human. Androids can't do it. But it stripped all that kind of stuff out, and a whole lot of other stuff to do with the relationship with animals as well, which again was meant to be very important to the human. I also thought that the film more or less turned the book's moral position upside down. I mean, not totally, because Dick opens up every possible way of interpreting the human-android relationship, but the film did in the end, I think, twist it right round in a way that's not quite what the book does at all. However, having watched the film about 8 times, I've become much more appreciative of it, and I do think it works very well in its own terms, and it's actually succeeded in making a very good film out of really quite difficult, complex science fictional material, and it had to actually strip away the complexity to actually work. It wouldn't have worked. Anyway, to pick up on some of your points, I do agree that but that first film is concerned, well, both films are concerned with the idea of becoming human through suffering, through compassion, and I would say through mortality as well. We talk of the replicants being programmed to die as a way of stopping them becoming human. And that's true in terms of the very limited lifespan they appear to be given in the first film. It's not so clear in the second film. In the first film, they're given 4 years, I think, and the idea is that it will stop them actually becoming fully human. But being programmed to die seems to me actually to make them fully human, really. Because until the last few moments of Blade Runner, in fact, the bit that you actually showed, until those last few moments, Rutger Hauer, the actor playing Roy Batty, I mean, to me, is dangerously close to being more than human. You use the phrase more than human in a positive way quite a few times, but I actually find the phrase more than human quite threatening. And he basically looks like an Aryan Ubermensch figure who basically has a contempt for slaves and extraordinary physical strength. He actually looks pretty much like the fantasies of the SS officers, the fantasy figure of the SS officers whose diaries Philip K. Dick read in Berkeley And he concluded from these diaries that these people were not human. They could not be human to have such a lack of empathy. And from that, the whole basis of his novel developed. So the whole basis of the original novel developed from almost like a Rutger Hauer kind of figure, actually. These the blonde Aryan Ubermensch, who doesn't show empathy. So obviously, what happens at the end there is that we see Rutger Hauer, with a bleeding head, a nail through his hand, and dying. And at that moment, he does become fully human to us. He does become one of us because he has a vulnerable, mortal body like us. And earlier, the film was really playing with the more than human idea, which I found, a weird kind of circular thing, taking it back to where Philip K. Dick started, in a sense, with these SS officers and their kind of Aryan fantasies. In addition to the fully human involving a capacity for suffering, a capacity for empathy, and an exposure to death, you quote this very eloquent passage from Philip K. Dick about what the authentic human being might be. And this is someone who cannot be compelled to be what they are not, who quietly refuses to violate their principles, their core principles. This is what he really admires. But of course, Dick was always contradicting himself, and it's partly why his novels are so alive and dynamic. And against that quotation, I would set what the Christ-like figure of Mercer in the novel tells Descartes, when Descartes is confessing to him about how he feels guilty about killing all these androids. And Mercer, in his almost Christ-like role, says, "You will be required to do wrong, no matter where you go. It is the basic condition of life, to be required to violate your own identity." The sacredness of all life was a central principle of Mercerism, the kind of analogue to Christianity that's in the novel. But even that principle might have to be compromised. It was a dirty job killing those androids, but someone had to do it, just as somebody had to fight the Nazis. Somebody had to kill Germans, basically, to defeat the Nazis. So the moral principle here is that you cannot act effectively in the world without getting your hands dirty. And in the novel, Hard to be a God, to go back to that one, we actually are told, if God undertakes to clean an outhouse, let him not believe that his hands will remain clean. Which is, taking that kind of position. And lastly, I've now watched the sequel, Blade Runner 2049, twice, and particularly on the second viewing, I really, really enjoyed it and thought actually it is a very intelligent sequel, building very effectively on the first film, but doing something different. And I agree with you that the replicant belief in a miraculous child who is born, not made, who will give them hope, gives very strong theological colouring to the whole plot. And I liked your point about the Galatians syndrome. So I thought that worked well. But I do wonder if there are not more ironies about all this than you actually acknowledged in your quite persuasive reading. So at the end, and we did see this at the end because you let the clip run on, a very old-looking Harrison Ford, and that, of course, in itself is quite powerful. It's quite moving. This is 45 years later in his own lifetime. He's 45 years older than he was in the first clip. You see him finally able, through the self-sacrificing help of the replicant K, as you pointed out, is it finally able to meet the child he fathered miraculously on Rachel, his android lover from all those years before. And there is some real emotion there, and I think actually the ending of Solaris is again a kind of influence here. With the the looking through the window at his father, looking through the glass at his father, as the return to Earth sequence. However, the daughter on whom the replicants have built all their hopes has an immunological defect, which means she has to be sealed off from the world, and so I'm just looking at my notes, and live forever in her own bubble, separated by glass from the rest of the world. The only way that she interacts with the world is through creating the false dreams and false memories with which replicants are implanted to create the illusion of a fully human consciousness. Yeah. So, if there is a religious allegory here, and in some ways the whole film is to some extent a religious allegory, possibly, then the principle of hope, which the daughter is, the miraculous child who gives the replicants hope, is forever cut off from real interaction with the world, except for a process whereby those aspiring to a fuller life are fed illusions, false memories, false dreams. So this seems to me like a potentially extremely cynical take on the religious implications which the film has been playing with all along. Yeah? Okay.
Well, the question is, first of all, whether she truly was suffering from the immunological disease, because that was the narrative that they were presenting to the outer world. But perhaps my understanding was that it was an imagined condition which would help her, as it were, seclude herself from the rest of the rest of humanity who could have been threatening to her because of who she was. Yeah. So I'm not convinced she was actually suffering from anything. Yeah. But that's, I suppose, debatable.
Yeah. But, I'm not sure whether she was or was not. The general image of somebody who is cut off from the world and only communicates with the world through planting false hopes and false dreams and false memories in people is quite a difficult one to deal with. To pull back a bit from saying, well, this is a very cynical take on the religious aspect. Is it actually so cynical? Because in the original novel, the Christ-like figure who toils up a hillside while rocks are thrown at him and with whom humans can fuse empathetically through the use of this special empathy box, is revealed in the novel towards the end to be an out-of-work actor with a drink problem who has actually faked up the whole Ascent of Calvary scenario. Okay. But the novel seems to say, so what? Nothing has actually changed. The truth of Mercerism is still true, even if Mercer himself is a fake. And theologically, this would be like arguing that Christianity is still essentially true, even if Jesus himself had never existed. And I actually have heard people maintain this position. So, I mean, I do think this is a very good series to...
They are. It's hard to say when and what Philip K. Dick believed, because his life was a bit crazy and he had all sorts of ideas and he changed them, from one year to the next and such. But thankfully, from my point of view, the film is divorced enough from the book to be able to stand on its own. In I don't see elements of Mercerism in the film, except in the first film, except the empathy box, which is indeed a bit odd, but that serves as a different device in the film. I know that Philip Dick was initially very upset with the Hollywood studios, and he said, "Oh, they're just going to do another Hollywood film, and he was very, very cross with them. But eventually, he liked this last screenplay, which was filmed. And I read somewhere that he said, well, it's a different book than mine, but it is very good and in many ways better than what I wrote. So he acknowledged that it acquired its own life. It no longer depended on the novel, except maybe as a sort of starting point. But I felt that, for instance, a lot of themes were stripped away, thankfully, because the novel is so incredibly complex and it has so many aspects and so many questions, like every single page is crammed with potential interpretations. But the film is much more sparse. It's, you know, it has been sort of, they've filtrated only a number of themes. Now, the script writer, I looked him up. He is not a theologian, nor are there any indications anywhere that he's even interested in theology or religion or any such thing. But as we could see, there are a lot of themes that have slipped through in the writing of the films. But very interesting what you said about Roy being the Ubermensch, you know, the almost like Nazi-like, you know, torturer, or indeed having him with you know, superhuman powers is not a very comforting thought. But that's in a sense, to me, that's the whole trick of the first Blade Runner film, that we live in terror of these sinister replicants. They are cruel and sinister, and they all appear to be, you know, they're strangely powerful. They seem to be more cunning. So they're not positive characters in the least. And Roy Batty, of course, is the scariest of them all. He truly is a frightening character. And at the end, that whole culmination of his pain and anguish and anger and revolt and all of that makes him even incredibly an incredibly frightening figure. And he remains frightening up until the very last. We could see that in Deckard's eyes. He's incredibly scared of what's coming to him after Roy has brought him back onto the roof of the building. What's very interesting to me is that this transition that I keep mentioning, the metanoia, you know, the transformation, really lasts 3 seconds in the film. You have this menacing, sinister android who says some words. He shows a degree of I don't know, perhaps sensitivity. But at the end, when he says it's time to die, he says it really kindly and with a very kind face. And it lasts, you know, a fraction of a second, the whole thing. And to me, that's the strength of it, in a sense, because he has this quick turnaround. I mean, yes, he has been constantly searching and searching and searching, but in that moment of death, he finds, you know, that type of freedom. But I agree with you. He remains an incredibly sinister character, which makes his transformation even more potent, I felt, at the end. But perhaps there are questions from the participants.
Yes. Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
First of all, thank you so much for a really interesting conversation. I thoroughly enjoyed it, and you've raised loads of amazing ideas. It's ages since I saw Blade Runner. I'm going to have to go and watch it again. But the thought I had was everybody's got to work this incredibly difficult puzzle of what it means to be human out for themselves. What resources do they have? What help do they have in order to do this? And I'm thinking of, in a theological setting, that quite often people have a help. I'm thinking of the books of Enoch, when Enoch is carried up and he's got a lovely angel messenger to show him everything and explain him everything. Job had to work it out for himself, but at least he had the council scenario. It got Satan provoking him to work it all out. And I wonder, is there anything like that in these films, which says, you know, are they just left on their own to work this out, or what resources do they have?
I would say that they were left on their own. It is their loneliness which makes it so tragic. They're completely separated from humans, and they must stay that way. And there's that a sense of loneliness.
Well, the man who made them in each film is a kind of false father figure in a way, and a false god in a way. You know, I mean, particularly in the second film, he's extremely sinister, Wallace, isn't he? And his he has this future orientation towards populating the galaxy with with replicants, and so you know that they're deprived of a biological father, obviously, and that they have a their manufacturer, but this manufacturer is not really going to deliver for them. Even in the first film, Rutger Hauer does seem to want something from the father, which the father can't give, if I remember it correctly. In the second film, the father figure is extremely sinister.
But in 2001, is the monolith in some sense some kind of goad to get them to understand things? I mean, what does that provoke them to start thinking about this, or are they just left as bereft as anybody else?
No, in the film, I mean, the monolith is a kind of god figure which is kind of guiding them, but whether it's guiding them up the wrong path a lot of the time is another matter. In the novel that was simultaneous with the film, there's much more explanation about super intelligent aliens and what they're trying to do for the human race, which is fine in a science fictional way, but is actually less powerful than the film, really, which really does leave different explanations open. Yes, the monolith is meant to be a kind of guiding figure, I think. And certainly in the novel, it's made clear that this small group of apes would have become extinct without the ability to use tools and rise up the food chain, basically. So they were given a really good push at that point.
Christoph has a question. Let me unmute you, Christoph.
Do you want to mute me back again, Razvan?
No, I think it's okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, Christoph, go ahead.
I just have a question. So I've never watched the films actually. You already touched upon this aspect, but could you say a little bit more about the human intention behind? I mean, you were mainly talking about this act of transformation, but why are they actually created? What's the intention behind it? What's the original purpose of them coming into being?
Basically, as slaves, really, as robots, humanoid robots who will do difficult and dangerous work off-world. In the novel, they're mainly used off-world, and they're not actually even meant to be on Earth unless they have a special license, and they basically escaped from off-world and come back onto the Earth. So that they are. In the novel, it's even clearer that there's a sort of analogy with slavery, and at some point, slaves will perhaps gain consciousness and rebel. So that's why they're created, basically, as purely instrumentally.
Okay.
It seems in the second film, there seems to be a hint to more than that when Wallace, the manufacturer in the second film, when he speaks about populating the galaxies with billions of replicants, whom he refers to as, I think in his mind, replicants and humans are pretty much the same thing. So it's unclear. I think perhaps there is this sense that in the future these replicants will sort of live free lives as humans, on other planets, replacing, in a sense, the human race. That seems to be the slightly sinister motivation of this Wallace fellow. But at the moment, but in both films, they're pretty much just instruments. They're used as slaves or tests or something like that. Thank you very much for coming. First of all, thank you to Professor Rowland Wymer for being with us, and thank you very much for your answers to my slightly obsessive quest for becoming, in Blade Runner. But that, on a personal level, that was what struck me. And thank you all who have attended for your patience, and thank you for coming.